Well, we've been trying to answer this question of how do we live our faith in life. From the very beginning, Q50 has had three statements that we want to define us: that we are compelled by love, we are convinced by faith, and we are engaged in life. And this series is putting the emphasis perhaps a little bit more on that third one, being engaged in life. But that can only happen if we understand the first two, that we are compelled by love, by Christ's love, and we are convinced by faith of his goodness, of his love, his mercy, of his holiness, his righteousness, and his authority over all things. So in previous videos, we have talked about some of the foundational ideas that have brought us to this point, so we can express and live our faith in life. Allow me to do just a really quick summary to remind us of those. In the very first video, the introductory video, we talked about creation theology. And this is our Father's world, and all things are subject to his authority. So we can have confidence to engage in his creation, because that's why we were made, to represent him, to be his image bearers. In the second video, we talked about God's grace. God's grace as extended to Adam and Eve when they sinned. God's grace as it is extended to everybody by his common grace. The rain falls on the just and the unjust. We all have air in our lungs. The world continues on its cycles because of God's loving common grace. He created the world with value, and it still has value, and that's why he redeemed it. So that brings us to the grace of Calvary and the love of God in giving his Son and Jesus' willing sacrifice on the cross, the ultimate demonstration of grace so we could be reconciled to the Father. And then last week, we talked about our credibility to represent Christ well. What is the greatest good that we can do? We had asked that question for a couple of weeks and came to the conclusion that our greatest good is to represent Christ well. We are God's image bearers, and now as members of Christ's kingdom, we need to represent him as our king and take this good news and share it with those who've not yet heard. So that brings us to the question that perhaps you've been waiting for, and that's the question of how do we do that? And I want to suggest that we take a two-pronged approach to answering that question. First, we need to talk about our posture as we seek to represent Christ well. Just as in any endeavor in life, your posture, how you do it, how you hold a tool, or how you prepare for a race is going to have great and direct impact on how well you complete that task. So also our posture in representing Christ well, if that is our greatest good, and it is very important. Now we could go on, that could be another entire series. What does it mean to have this posture that represents Christ well? But let me summarize it with these 3 points. First, just like Jesus wept over the city of Jerusalem as Jesus was moved by compassion, we need to be characterized in representing Christ well. We need to engage with people from a posture of compassion. We need to acknowledge the struggle is real, sin is real. And even though people may live in rebellion against God, and they did in the time of Christ, we still engage with them with compassion. Secondly, we need to remember that the message that Jesus has left us is called the gospel, good news. It is a positive message, a message of reconciliation of ourselves, of all. It's available to everyone to be reconciled to God. Now, not everyone is going to respond. Not everyone is going to see it as a positive message. But as we engage with people and as we think through our responsibility to represent Christ well, our tension that may exist between values and priorities and passions of those who do not know Christ and for us as citizens of his kingdom is not because we are condemning people. It is because we have a positive good news message for them. So we embrace the positive message, the good news of Jesus Christ. And third, if we're going to represent Christ well, we need to remember the condition in which we have all found ourselves. and that which we have in common with those we share this good news, even though they may reject it, even though they may reject it with hostility. According to 1 Corinthians chapter 2, spiritual things can only be perceived by spiritual people, and it is the Spirit of God that does that work within us to make us receptive to the good news of Jesus Christ. But at one time, we were all blind. At one time, we were all enemies of God. And it is only by His grace that we have been brought into relationship with God through Christ. We can't forget that. We have all gone from blindness to light. Secondly, if we are going to represent Christ well, our posture needs to include a willingness to listen. There are a lot of complaints about the gospel, and many of them are valid. There have been horrific abuses committed in the name of Christ. There have been wars started in the name of Christianity. There has been a blind eye turned to injustice and suffering by those who claim to follow Jesus. We need to listen. And finally, we need to recognize that this struggle, even though we have been reconciled to God, this struggle continues within us. We still continue with sin. We still continue to struggle against sin. And our environment, our God's created order, the world is still contaminated by sin. The struggle is real, and we all continue to struggle with it. We have not joined the elite. We do not have the superiority because in some way we have secret insider knowledge about faith. The struggle is real. So that posture, bringing that posture to engaging in life is extremely important, especially as we seek to represent Christ well. So let's now talk about perspective. How do we put these pieces together? And I suggested last week that you take a moment and read through the book of 1 Peter. Here is a group of people undergoing phenomenal persecution for something they did not do. They were not responsible for the fire at Rome, and yet it was blamed on them, and Nero unleashed all his hatred and anger on the Christians, predominantly the Christians, but also some Jews as well. So as you read through the book of 1 Peter and you read about the fiery trials they're going through, it puts it into a little bit of context. If you haven't read 1 Peter, please go back and do that. But I want to base this next few minutes on 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 15 to 16, and make three observations about the nature of how we engage our faith in life so we represent Christ well. Let me read 1 Peter 3, 15 to 16. It says, "But in your hearts set apart Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. But do this with gentleness and respect, keeping a clear conscience, so that those who speak maliciously against your good behavior in Christ may be ashamed of their slander." Notice how Peter ends this talking about representing Christ well. So even though people may disagree, even though they see the goodness, ultimately they will be corrected. They will be able to glorify God and recognize what they've said as slander. But what is it that Peter has said to these people about the nature of engaging in faith? Well, like Jesus warned us in John chapter 15, verse 18, and in John 16, verse 33, right before he went to the cross, he said, "The world hates me, and it's also going to hate you. But don't worry, I have overcome the world." As we look at 1 Peter 3, 15 to 16, we have to remember this is in the context of hostility. These people have been persecuted and rejected and being forced from their homes, their goods being confiscated from them, loved ones being executed because of their faith. Not trying to be negative about this, but to be honest and to recognize that throughout history, God's people have suffered because of their willingness and desire to have integrity in their faith. So three observations that we can make then about this perspective. First, it is rational. The word that's used, you've probably heard this before, the word that is used about giving an answer, translated giving an answer, comes from the word we would call apologetic, not in the sense of I'm sorry, and a typical part of Canadian culture, but apologetic in that there's a reasoned and a defendable presentation of truth. There is a rational element to engaging our faith. And when we feel the pressure of people trying to force their value system and their belief system on us, we need to listen to it, because there's probably a point of contact there. There's probably a truth there somewhere. But we also need to be able to present our beliefs, our knowledge of the Creator God, in an intelligent, in a careful, in a well-articulated, gracious way. Secondly, our posture also has to be relational. Peter tells this church that their response is to be gentle and with reverence. It is relational. And that word gentle in the culture of Peter's day was related very much to the idea of friendship. That I'm respecting this person as my friend, not as my enemy. Now, y'all know that I love to curl on Friday nights, and one of the things that irritates me about curling, and I will actually challenge people, is when we're getting ready to go, and it's just in a good-natured, teasing kind of way, but they will refer to our competition as the enemy. I hate that. You're not my enemy. You're my opposition. You're my competition, and hopefully you will play well so it brings out the best in me, and I will play well so it brings out the best in you. But that gentle attitude, instead of a confrontational and an adversarial approach to the relationship, our posture needs to be one of gentleness. Now, gentle people do get run over. The meek will inherit the earth, but meanwhile, they're going to have to pull themselves out from about 6 inches of topsoil. That's true. And Jesus warned us about that. He said, I've overcome the world, but the world is not going to be in love with you. So there's the sense of gentleness. And the third one is that there is respect. Respect and reverence. Peter says that we should give an answer for the hope that is within us with gentleness and reverence or respect. And this is the idea of humility, of not knowing it all. And we may know some answers to something in the creation debate and have some clever response. And I've seen YouTube videos where people are doing evangelism, and they ask a series of leading questions, and then they twist and it's a bait and switch, and boom, the person's embarrassed because they've been led down this garden path, and then they've been forced into an option that just basically gives them one exit to say, I'm right, you're wrong. That is not humility. That is not gentleness. That is not a carefully reasoned apologetic. If we go on a little bit more in the book of 1 Peter, he talks about the need for humility. In fact, he's already talked about it in chapter 2, verses 18 and 21. Let's take a look at those verses. Speaking here to the lower levels of society, he says, slaves, submit yourselves to your master with all respect, not only those who are good and considerate, not only good bosses, but those who are harsh. For it is commendable if a man bears up under the pain of unjust suffering, because he is conscious of God. But how is it to your credit if you receive a beating for doing wrong and enduring it? But if you suffer for doing good and endure it, this is commendable before God. To this you were called, because Christ suffered for you, leaving an example that you should follow in his steps. The suffering of Christ is itself an incredible example of humility and gentleness. In fact, we can go back to Isaiah chapter 8, when Isaiah was prophesying that Israel was going to go into its own exile and punishment for its unfaithfulness to God. He still offered them hope. Holiness and hope go hand in hand. In chapter 8, verse 12, let's take a look at those verses. Do not call conspiracy everything that these people call conspiracy. Do not fear what they fear, and do not dread it. The Lord Almighty is the one you are to regard as holy. He is the one you are to fear. He is the one you are to dread. And he will be a sanctuary. Both for the houses of Israel, he will be a stone that causes men to stumble, and a rock that makes them fall. And for the people of Jerusalem, he will be a trap and a snare. So the priority is to focus on who is God and don't fear the environment, the political environment of that day. Fear God. Notice he goes on in verse 17. I will wait for the Lord who is hiding his face from the house of Jacob. I will put my trust in him. And when we face the tension in our culture and we are overwhelmed by what appears to be no-win situations, our faith says to us, because we are convinced by faith, that I will trust in the Lord. Now, sometimes, and throughout the history of the church, frequently, that means that we suffer loss and we suffer injustice. But the kingdom of God is such that it's worth it. The greatness of God, the goodness of God, the future that he has planned when he brings all things to an end will be worth it if we are faithful to him. So how do we engage then? This is not the what, we'll deal with that later, but how? First of all, a posture of compassion, of positive message, and of representing Christ well, where we listen and we don't condemn. And secondly, a perspective where we have a rational, a defendable response. We are gentle and we interact with people with humility.